Hi everyone, welcome to the Gratiaen PODS. My name is Haadiyah Marikar and today we have with us Sita Brahmachari. Sita is an acclaimed children's author and her debut novel Artichoke Hearts won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize. She has also been nominated for the Philip Carnegie Medal and has been shortlisted for the UK LA Book Awards. Sita's books have been translated into many languages across the world, and she is one of the most important voices in children's literature today. Thank you, Sita, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
So just to kick things off, what would you say is your earliest memory of reading and books?
Growing up in the Lake District, I used to love Beatrix Potter's stories, and I remember I had a little collection of tiny books, and they were like the size of my hand, and I would turn the pages and they'd be magical animal stories where the kind of animals had human features. They'd really be sort of little stories with tales about human relations to the countryside, how humans were caring for the countryside, how humans were caring for each other. So I loved those tales. But I didn't find lots and lots of books that I loved when I was a child. I loved poetry. I remember my uncle who's also a poet, Sita Brahmachari, and he gave me a little collection of poetry called For Your Delight. And I loved those poems and I memorised those poems. But my dad was a great oral history storyteller, and I absolutely loved his stories. And he used to talk about his childhood in India, and I sort of would go home and I would write those little stories out in my notebook. So I was a reader, but I was also an early writer. And then I would read back my own writing and I would think about how I could make that better. So it was the two together. And then I found, as an early teenager, I found Maya Angelou's diaries and autobiographical work. I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings, Singing and Swinging, that collection. It sort of changed my life. I literally read those books and thought, wow, this is somebody speaking about extraordinary injustice, but speaking about it in an inspiring way, using writing to find an extraordinary way through difficulty, but also highlighting for people the realities of the world. And I just thought, wow, she's writing diaries, I'm writing diaries, maybe there's something in this writing thing.
And what got you into writing for children specifically?
Many, many years later, when I left university, I studied literature at university. And one of the things that I did at university was I was in a play and I was the witch. And we went on a tour. She was a really sort of extraordinary witch with amazing sort of golden hair. And she was a great witch to play. And we went on a tour around primary schools. And it was a really good production. And the director has turned into quite a famous director. And it was fantastic. We went around all these primary schools, and the delight in the children's eyes of that play. And also, funnily enough, I always felt very free with children in a way that I didn't always feel free with adults. Felt very self-conscious sometimes speaking up with adults. But children have such a beautiful, immediate response to you as a performer, as a person. It's often very true. And if you're true with them, they're true with you. And I think I felt that. And then when I left university, I started working in youth theatre for young people, to help them tell their stories and to help them realise that their stories in the diaspora and the diversity of London, where I was then working, were important stories to tell. And that linked back to my own feeling as a child of, oh, I was writing these stories and my family diaspora stories were amazing, but I wasn't really finding them. So I got great joy in going into different communities and saying to people, oh, you're from the Bangladeshi community, you're from the Moroccan community, you're from your stories. Go and speak to your grandparents, go and speak about this history, go and find out about the history of this house. And getting these children hooked. And it sort of fulfilled something in me. But it was a long time before I plucked up the courage to write my own stories. And in fact, I was 40 when Artichoke Hearts was published. But I had been writing all of that time, and all of these stories and more have been written since I was 40. But I had all the stories in my mind from when I was a child. And I've got journals and notebooks for Jasmine Skies, which is about a 14-year-old girl who goes to Calcutta to trace her family history. I started writing that book in my early teens when I had my travel journal. So they were all really, the children that I've just been working with Gratiaen Trust and the British Library, I said to them, the ideas and the feelings I had about the world and the what ifs, what if we could do things in this way, what if we could all understand that we live on the same planet for environmental concerns that we have, those what ifs and those strong feelings I had when I was a child about what was wrong with the world, what was right with the world, they're the same feelings and the same questions that I'm asking now as an adult writer. And placing my work for children is because I really, really wanted to find that work when I was young. Work which explores mental health, well-being, identity, dual identity, climate change, a death in the family, grief, all of these things. I looked for those books when I was a child and I didn't find them. And I believe that children can take in so much more than we think that they can. And they do, especially now in this digital age. They're taking in everything. And adults can sometimes say, we don't think children should see this stuff. But they're seeing it, and if we don't give them the stories which are held consciously for them in a tone that they can accept, they're going to find the stories somewhere else. And that's not good. So I feel that it's part of my job as a children's author to face some of the really big challenges of the world and to find a way to tell a story which can be hopeful and that can also give children a sense of power and agency that they often don't feel.
And how do you find that voice that children can relate to and the children can follow and would keep on reading your books and want to learn more and process what they're feeling?
So I love meeting children. I do a lot of visits to schools, and obviously I've had my own children. And a bit of me just doesn't forget how I felt when I was a child. It's such an intense period of life. I've always stayed connected to that. And I always want to stay connected to this feeling of, it's not fair. When adults say to children, life isn't fair, get on with it, it makes me really angry, because that feeling of curiosity that the child has about, how come life's like this for somebody and it's somebody like, I think it's really important to encourage that curious voice, because in that curious voice is a journey of a life that may end up being a child wanting to heal other people, to be a doctor or a nurse or something like that, or a writer or a filmmaker or it will be where their life's journey takes them. So we must encourage those voices. But the main way that I get into these different characters is I'm just very playful. I love meeting people. I quite often travel around on, like, I love transport, so I often travel around on a London bus and I listen to the children as they come out of school, what they're saying, how they're speaking, you know. And I never write about exactly what they are saying, but I sort of listen to the way that they're communicating with each other. And because it's important when you write for young people today that you find a way of connecting. So if I wrote in the way that life was when I was growing up, it would quickly be dated. But if I keep in contact with how young people are today, by my research, sometimes, like one of my stories that isn't here, Red Leaves, I created a Somali heroine. She was a Somali refugee, and there are very few Somali refugee children or Somali children in books in Britain. And she was the heroine of the book. But obviously I'm not Somali, I don't know about that culture and their religion and whatever. So I went and worked with a group of Somali children in the east of London for a year and did creative writing workshops with them. And I kept giving them, they kept giving me their writing, and I kept giving them my writing. And they would say, oh, we really like this bit, but no, this isn't right. And no, Sita, you couldn't do this because this would be offending me if you said this. And you know, really deep work, deep research work, where you as a writer and you as a human learn yourself. And that, I always say that if you ever are going to attempt to write somebody that is other than yourself, or other religion or other culture or whatever, you have to do so with such great respect. Sometimes you can do it. Sometimes you just say, you know what, I don't really feel I can do justice to that character. I have to know what my limitations are, and sometimes I don't. But often I will work with young people. And in the back of that book, for example, Red Leaves, there's a whole list of the children's names. So often I feel like my name is on the books, but it's like I am also an auteur in that sense of filmmaking, where there's a director and a writer and actors, and it almost feels when I'm writing them that I am holding close some of the young people that have moved me or touched me in my life. Like in When Shadows Fall, the children who were excluded from school that I worked with when I was just out of university. And they were such amazing, talented young people, but they were already outside of the school gates, being left really to their own devices. And that story, When Shadows Fall, has never left me. I didn't have a title for it, but I always wanted to write a story about those children. And so that was my latest book, When Shadows Fall. I started writing it when I was 25 years old. I had little patchwork pieces in my journal about what if we continue allowing these children to be outside of the school gates and not investigating why their behaviour is what it is. What is behind it? That was my what if.
So you worked with a variety of children. Now you worked with Sri Lankan kids, you worked with Somali kids. How do you adapt with the different groups that you work with?
Yeah, so many different, and in fact in the Refugee Centre that I work with in London over the last 12 years really, with Jane Ray, who's the illustrator of some of my books. So we've got this very symbiotic, close relationship where word and image flow together, because obviously many people who newly arrived, the English language is a problem, or not a problem, but still to be learnt. And so we often, for example, first of all, offer some images, and from the images, for example, the river, people will reach for the words that they want to emotionally talk about. That, many people are, teachers in their own countries, or adults, or parents, or whatever. We try to teach in a way that isn't infantilizing them, that is allowing them to express something for themselves. So, for example, introducing the idea of a river, you can get poetry, you can get paintings of rivers, people can start to talk about the rivers of their homes, the rivers that run through them, the rivers that connect them. You get that sort of storytelling. So I really work with people from all over the world who's got roots and branches all over the world. They could be first generation, second generation, third generation. But I do believe there's a line in Worry Angels, which is just a small novella, where a little girl observes from Britain. She observes that people speak with their hands, they speak with their eyes, they speak with a gesture. And what we should be doing as humans is we should be, and Omid, a Syrian refugee child, says it in When Shadows Fall, people do not read enough the language of the eyes, he says. And so I think everything, storytelling, meeting people, everything is about the quality of the engagement, and also how much you're willing to understand. You might have written lots of books, you might be in a new place, you might think you understand something, but you have to be always willing to learn. And I think one of the great things about writing and reading is when you come out of reading a book that you've got really involved in, you feel like a slightly different person than when you started it. Where the River Runs Gold is a book set in the future where the bees seem to have disappeared. It's a Aldous Huxley type vision of a future where we don't really do enough for to stop climate change, which obviously is particularly significant here and all over the world. But in that story, I was not good at science at school, but I had to learn loads of science. I had to learn about the science of pollination, how things are pollinated, how quickly they're pollinated. If the bees disappeared, what food will people eat? the technological implications of the bees disappearing. Wow, it was amazing. It was an amazing journey. And I learned science, which I never really learnt at school. Every book is a learning opportunity.
And that's something I just love, that your names are just so diverse.
Yeah.
How do you go about, is there a process when you're choosing a name for your characters? And how do you go about
Well,
it?
I meet a lot of children, and they come and I sign books for them, and they come and they say, and their name, they have to have their name signed. And I go, oh, that's a nice name. I've never seen that name in a book before. Could I put your name in a book? Oh, yes. And I say, because in Artichoke Hearts, the writing teacher says, what is a derivation of your name? Where does your name come from? Names hold histories, so get digging. And that's always her first writing exercise. It's something that I do all the time. And if you just think about that, think about who named you, why you were named, the history of your name, the mythology around your name, who else you're named after in your family, what do you think of your name, does somebody call you a nickname? Immediately, you're time traveling, you're going into histories, you're going to inheritance, you're going to story. So immediately you get story. So I'm fascinated by names, and quite often my names also have a significance in the story. Like Shifa, in Where the River Runs Gold, means healing in Arabic. And she, although she lives in a land where the environment has been completely eroded, she finds tiny bits of flowers and herbs around, and she collects them in her seed packets, and she keeps them against her heart. And then once she goes to another place, she just spreads the seeds. So there's a scene in that book, which is a triumphal scene, where she's travelling on a train across the land. And she's been told that this vegetation doesn't exist, and that only a few people can have this food. And that it doesn't exist anymore because the bees don't exist anymore. But they may exist somewhere. She may be being told a lie. And she takes her seed packet, and she's travelling fast across the lands, and she scatters the seeds. And so we have to imagine, years later, that the land is regenerating. Shifa is called healing. And so and Temba, her little brother, is Temba is trust. So often I will search and search and search for a name, and it's really a sort of like a victory moment when I find the right name for the character.
And it's so good, because I remember the first time I read what I would consider Sri Lankan names was in a children's book called Mithil's Secret. And yeah, that was lovely, and I'm sure lots of children have that experience.
With a name, but with a language, recently with another story called Swallow's Kiss. And it's for really little ones. And their language is Lingala, which is an African language which is spoken by millions of people, which in my ignorance I had not heard of until I met Lingala speakers at the Refugee Centre. And there was a particular moment at the Refugee Centre where these women were speaking in Lingala language. And they were in an English class, and so they had to start speaking English again. And this woman turned to me, and she said, you know, Sita, when we speak Lingala, we are in our homes again. And then I said to her, let's write a little poem or something about that. And she said, she sang, the woman, she wrote a little poem and then she sang it. And it was, Lingala is the language that my heart first heard. Lingala is the language that my voice first spoke. Lingala is the language of my heart and soul. Lingala, Lingala, Lingala. And she got everybody singing it. And it was so wonderful. Then we went to a school. I put it in the story. And then we went to the school, with her permission. We went to the school to do this. And we said, we had these wishing birds, which are part of the story. And we said this song, Lingala. And this little girl just jumped up. I speak Lingala, she said. And she carried her wishing bird with her. And she taught everybody in her own language a song. So it's kind of that sense of I belong. I think a sense of belonging is in all of my books. Children finding a place to be, a place to feel free, and a place to belong is probably the one thread that goes through all of my stories.
And how would you advise authors who write books for young children in bringing in that diversity in their books? What strategies would you give them when they're doing that?
I think, when you're a writer, you have to also be in the world. And I think there's so much you can do with your imagination. I mean, I never have a problem. Just give me 2 or 3 things, I'll put them together, I'll create a creature, I'll create a land, whatever. Most writers don't have a problem doing that. But the world is a very fissured place. And so when you are stepping into somebody else's shoes that's not your own, and you're writing a story that maybe the child is facing difficulties. Maybe in the protagonist, for example, in Artichoke Hearts, the child is losing her grandmother. Okay, so how are you going to hold that story in a way that's not going to traumatize that child? You have to sort of know children. You have to spend time with children to know at which point do I create the magical charm that the child is going to have, that they're always going to have to hold. And when they have that charm, they're going to feel strong. How am I going to create a sustaining story for those children? If you're creating a story with a child, for example, like Omid in When Shadows Fall, who's a Syrian refugee child, or Parry, who's from Iraq in Tender Earth, or even Lila, who's from Britain, who's just a shy girl who never knew her grandmother and feels a bit left out in her sibling order. If you're creating a story which is they're the protagonist, what is the impact of the story on the child like that? That's always my first question. I want that child to be the protagonist, but I also want to know that the child who's reading the story, who's a little bit like that, is going to feel empowered by reading it. So in order to do that, you do need to do your research. You need to, if you're stepping into another culture, history, religion, tradition, you need to do your research. You need to learn.
And I think that, as a children's author, you have more responsibility, because something that I know is if I go into a reading rut, a really good way to get back in is to read a children's book.
Because, how lovely is that?
Yeah, because a book written for children is a book that's supposed to capture attention and make you want to read. And I think that makes it a much harder job to do.
One of the teachers that I was working with in Gaul yesterday, I was trying to because I think, sometimes when you're teaching, say, to get children through exams and teaching literature, how do we look at this literature, etc., etc. What we forget to ask is, what did the stories that we love do for us, ourselves, when we were growing up? And that's how I started the workshop. And you could see this sort of glow and this smile go across people's faces as they remembered. And one of the teachers was saying that after she left home to go to university, she returned to the same book that she had been her favourite book in the teenage years. And she just read it and read it and read it. And she said, that book was home for me.
That resonates within me as well. And it's so important for us to encourage our kids to read. And I feel like we're in an age where, we're in such a rush to do everything and priorities are changing. And something I've also heard my aunts tell their cousins is, you're wasting your time, put that book down and do some work. What would you say to the adults who say things like that? What's your advice for them on why we should encourage our children to read?
First of all, the research shows that the most disenfranchised child who has nothing, if they have books, they will fulfill their ambitions and their dreams. If they have books, if they're taught to read first, and if they have books, and then they have the volition to go and find the books that allow them to explore the worlds that they want to enter, they are on an extraordinary journey. And even if they don't have the best teachers or that whatever, they will have that journey through books. They will be able to enter worlds that they never would have been able to travel to. So that's the first thing. And the research absolutely shows that children who don't read for pleasure do less well academically. But that's not the reason for me. The reason for me is a lifelong love of learning, of reading, is a lifelong love of learning about the world, about other people. It's a place to be, and it's a place to belong when the world gets tough. So when your children have maybe gone through systems and they've passed exams or whatever, and they're like that teacher and they've gone off somewhere else, if they know that a book is a place for them to be, it's one of the other places. It could be music, it could be dance, it could be whatever, but it's a place for them to feel they've got space to explore things, to feel whole. It's a kind of anchor in their lives. It's an emotional anchor for young people and older people at any different parts of their life. So children will often ask me, what's your favourite book ever? I never can answer that question, because my favourite book when I was like a child is a different book than when I was, say, a young mother, than when I'm now older. I need different books at different times in my life. But that addiction, if you like, to looking for something in a book is something that is the best addiction that anyone could have.
So instead of me asking what your favorite book is, let me ask you, what book are you recommending to people these days?
Well, I absolutely love Arundhati Roy's writing, and so The God of Small Things is one of my favourite. I have to say, is one of my favourite books. Partly because, you know, one of the things that I do in my own writing is I sort of patchwork piece together memory and imagination through small things. And what I love about The God of Small Things, which I quote at the beginning of When Secrets Set Sail, which is a story of the nursemaids of empire who took the children back to London in particular, and often those women didn't get the opportunity to travel back home, and they were left on the streets of London, ending up in this house in London. They're not, the sari, the white muslin sari becomes an important image in that book, and a conch shell. They might be considered to be small and humble things, as in The God of Small Things, but in each of those small things, or a person's life who might not be a celebrity, is an extraordinary story. And those are the stories that I'm interested in. The stories about the small heroes and the small acts of kindness that you often don't hear about. The people that take time with you, sometimes when you're a child, to notice something. They're all in my books, those people. And sometimes, you know, as we hurry through life, we all forget that every interaction you have with somebody else can actually change things for them.
Is there anything you'd like to say to our young Sri Lankan writers out there? Any advice you'd like to give them? Encouragement?
One of the things that people assume about writing is that it's this very skillful thing that only a few people can do. And I don't believe that, because I believe that the best stories are written with the heart, and they are stories that have to emerge. Yeah, they're a way of expressing yourself in the world. And they come first of all from the heart. Then if you read, you can be better at honing that skill. Or if you get taught about literature, you can get better at honing that skill. Everybody that I have met, including the children, have amazing stories to tell. And I believe that they are stories that are little told. And so, me personally, I would love to read those stories of the people that I have met. Silent child in one of the sessions that I've worked in was able to lift up his notebook and show me and go like this, flick, 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 the pages of writing that he had done. So there is not one kind of learner, and if we only allow one kind of learning, those children who may just be your writers of the future will feel like they don't belong in books, as I did when I was a child.
Thank you so much, Sita. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I hope you have enjoyed your stay in Sri Lanka and that you'll enjoy tomorrow as well. And with that, we have come to the end of the interview. Thank you so much for watching. You can find Sita's books online and even at the British Council Digital Library. For more chats, interesting chats like this, please visit the Gratiaen Trust website and keep updated on events and other programs that they may have. Thank you.